Welcome back, and thanks so much for joining us. I'm Felicia Adams Kellum, President and CEO of St. Joseph Center and a proud member of Housing California's board. Thanks again to all of our sponsors and to all of you for being here. I'm honored to introduce our next session, Housing as Wealth, Ownership, Reparations, Housing Justice, moderated by my fellow board member, Lisa Matuyama, and joined by a powerful panel of speakers. This topic is near and dear to my heart because it raises important questions, such as, how can we create homeownership opportunities so that families and communities that have been left out can build wealth? And how can we close the racial wealth gap in our state? To explore those and other questions, I'm glad to turn it over to Lisa. Enjoy the conversation.
Thank you, Felicia. So good afternoon. My name is Lisa Motoyama. I am a Housing California board member and also a senior affordable housing finance consultant with Community Economics. Community Economics is a nonprofit that provides technical assistance and expertise to nonprofit affordable housing developers and leaders in local, state, government, and policy matters. And before we get started, I would like to take a poll to see who is in the session with us. Would you please set up the poll? Can we get the results, please? If enough people have responded. Okay, and can you put up the next poll, please? So that's a very interesting look at the way we do our work. So 63% of the folks in the room are renters and 37% are homeowners. But the work that we do is 90% multifamily rental. This panel, Housing as Wealth, came out of a discussion that started informally after a Housing California board meeting when Felicia Adams Kellum started discussing the importance of home ownership as wealth building. And I can tell you that I had the knee-jerk reaction of responding that, oh, multifamily rental housing leverages scarce housing dollars and that it's more effective than home ownership and serves more people. And I think a lot of people that do multifamily rental feel that way. And it is like a snap reaction. And however, when we started talking about it, and it was really homeownership and wealth building as reparations, it was an aha moment for me. And it makes tremendous sense in that reparations frame. In California, 63% of non-Hispanic white households are homeowners compared to 36% of Black households. And that gap has gotten worse since the Fair Housing Act of 1968. So systemic structural inequity is at work here, and systemic structural inequity is part of the cause of the California housing crisis. And as you may know from other panels today, that's something that Housing California's Roadmap 2030 is seeking to address. And since that conversation a few months ago, reparations has really been front and center in the news. In 2020, the state legislature passed AB 3121 that created the state task force to study and develop reparation proposals for African Americans, with a special consideration for African Americans who are descendants of persons enslaved in the United States. That panel has now been seated in LA County. On April 20th, the Board of Supervisors decided to return Bruce's Beach, the property in Manhattan Beach that was a prosperous Black-owned resort in the 1920s that was taken by eminent domain. In May of 2021, Evanston, Illinois is starting a reparations program through homeownership. And so you can see that this is really an important topic right now. And so why reparations now? Why is it so important in our social discourse is something I would like us to explore. And with that, I would like to have Theo Miller introduce himself and put this all into context for us.
Thanks so much, Lisa, and thank you, Alicia, so much for the panel. Thank you to the panelists. I already see Catherine in the chat. In my tradition, if you're not talking to me, you're not with me. So please definitely use the chat. Please definitely come in it. What an incredible conversation to have. What an incredible space to be in. And I'm happy, Lisa, to share my slides if that's easier, to just rock it. And so as I'm sharing my screen here, Theo Miller, used to be a public servant, but now it's good to just be out in the real world. So I served the last 3 mayors in San Francisco as the director of Hope SF, which we'll talk a little bit about. But my current role is as a co-principal for equity and results, and I'll talk a little bit about that. So I know this conversation is on reparations, and I'm just gonna take a couple minutes to, as Lisa said, situate this in context and then get out of the way, because we have an incredible panel for you today and hoping to have a lot of conversations. And sometimes when we talk about reparations, we talk about housing, we think about just the built environment. And I'll just call this young man Terry as an example. 7 years old, lives in Potrero Hill, the south side of Potrero Hill, raised by his grandmother, who lived in this community since the late 1950s as part of the Great Migration. And you see this incredible image of this brilliant young man who participates in the Walking School Bus, which is a community-driven initiative to walk him across the south side of Potrero Hill to his school at Star King Elementary in Potrero, so they can get there safely, so they can get there on time, a kind of community-driven initiative. And so this young man, again, I'll just call him Terry, is the descendants of slaves, right? He is a king, but he lives not just on stolen land, on stolen property, right? So this is Ohlone land. As we think about our indigenous communities, we think about all of those who are wrapped up in this conversation of reparations. So for us, when we were doing this work of affordable housing, of community development in San Francisco, we were confronted with this inconvenient truth Patrick Sharkey calls being stuck in place. And so we have a population of folks that are disproportionately Black, disproportionately folks of color, that were clearly back 8-9 years ago, substantially at a disadvantage to the living wage, to the area median income. So I just want to situate Terry. I want to situate the stories, the lived experience of incredible communities of color in this context. This is not charity. This is actually, how can we transform the built environment? How can we think about housing? How can we think about home ownership as a way to repair a systematic harm? So this is Potrero Hill right here, south side of it. You can see the Salesforce Tower and the incredible vistas of San Francisco off in the horizon. But you notice this community is totally cut off, right? So the street grid, totally disconnected. And you've got 1950s style barrack housing, military housing, just sort of slung on the hillside. And so part of the challenge for us as anti-racists, as folks who are interested in housing, is to think about how can we actually repair? How can we repair that systematic harm? And in San Francisco and in the Bay Area, those of you, and I know many folks in this space know the work with our affordable housing developers who are trying to right this wrong. And so, prior to the Democratic Party, prior to folks having all these commissions on reparations, we said we needed to come up with a framework to actually address this systematic, this horrific wrong, right? This stolen land, stolen people on stolen land. And so we defined reparations as this durable and enduring approach to reconciling and healing that systematic harm that's currently and historically experienced by communities of color, particularly Black and Indigenous folks. And so back when, the late Mayor Lee, who himself was born and raised in public housing, was doing all these groundbreakings and these ribbon ceremonies, we tried to utilize a frame of repairing that systematic harm. I know my brilliant colleague from Evanston is going to talk a bit about how they're doing it in Illinois, but for us in the Bay Area, we had to come to grips with this reality that we wanted to do affordable housing, but we didn't want to sit in the spaces of truth. We weren't yet ready to acknowledge the ways in which race and place were inextricably linked, to name it, to call out power. And so many times folks, do housing transformation, they want to get straight to liberation, right? And so this sort of visual here for us just gave us the space to say, let's first sit in truth. Let's acknowledge that historical wrong that has been enacted upon communities of color. And often we talk about truth and reconciliation, but we skip restitution. We don't restore and resource those opportunities that have been extracted from communities of color, right? And so that compensation, that direct anti-racist impact says restitution. And then maybe if we deal with restitution, we can get to reconciliation, and then we'll see what liberation looks like. Martin Luther King once said, right, that the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. And for us, in confronting the reality of our broken housing system, we had to sort of sit in that truth and that discomfort to say that just because, and this is here at West Point, this is in Hunter's View, Bayview Hunters Point in San Francisco. So on the left-hand side, you see these incredible new buildings, 100% affordable, some replacement public housing, some tax credit units, right across the street from that old dilapidated 1950s style public housing. But the notion that we were somehow doing something, we were somehow repairing a historic harm solely by building these new buildings was wrong. So to Lisa's provocative point, what does it actually mean to restore the systematic harm done upon communities of color? You see in this bottom right-hand picture, the basketball court in West Point, where so many folks both fellowship, celebrated, and also mourned the loss of loved ones who left too soon. So I include this image just by way of asking us to wrestle with what actually is reparations in the context of housing. And so for us in the Bay Area, sure, we replaced housing virtually at all levels of affordability. We had policies and principles that were about non-displacement. We gave folks multi-generational housing retention rights of return, but did we really give community power? Did we really center Black liberation? And so we're gonna have a conversation more so than this kind of didactic thing. It's just to say, what would reparations actually look like through housing? More than just a transaction. Would it look like centering the voices of residents? Would it look like spaces and places where we can all heal, white folks, folks of color, where we can deal with the trauma that this horror of white supremacy and racism has caused for us? Would it have anti-racist institutions? Would the corporations and the foundations step up in a way to drive themselves with impact, anti-racist impact? And would it have legislators and leaders like we see now Mayor Breed in San Francisco leading in budget and in legislation to actually have reparations public policy? And will we get to the wealth? And that's the question. Because I think what we've learned in this experiment of community development and affordable housing is that we can build the housing. We can build the housing, but as Olson Lee once said, if all we do is build the housing, we will have failed. And so this visual just kind of shows it's the challenge for me of how we actually can get there to ensure folks are better off. I'm gonna hand it back to you in a second, Lisa, and just to say, in terms of actually doing this work and getting to it, we oftentimes talk about how many units did we build? How much money did we spend, right? How many folks are living there? But do we, and this is sort of the language that we increasingly use now, do we capture is anyone better off as a result of it? So I hope that as we have this conversation about race and place and housing, that we keep central the anti-racist impact that we keep central in our mind this question, is anyone better off? So it's cool, we're talking about the horrors, the murder of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor. Maybe we remember Trayvon Martin. Maybe we remember Margo Woods. Maybe we see the racialized harm that's ongoing in the Bay Area. But in our strategies and in our work, can we hold to this question? Is anyone better off as a result of anything we're doing? And so again, gratitude to be in the space, gratitude just to have the conversation and this with these incredible panelists. And I will throw it back to you, Lisa. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Theo, for setting us up for a really provocative discussion. So now I'd like to have Sarah Flax introduce herself and talk about the important work that's being done in Evanston. As you know, The Color of Law, Richard Rothstein's book, talks about how it's really the structural racism, not individual choice, that creates segregation and policies that are racist and undermine community. So can you tell us about what Evanston is doing as the first city in the US to implement reparations through homeownership?
Sure. Thank you, Lisa. And thank you, Theo. Very interesting to see what you're working on. Let me give you a little bit of background about Evanston, Illinois. I don't know how many of you are familiar with Evanston. We're the first suburb north of Chicago on Lake Michigan. So we're an old inner ring suburb. We're also the home of Northwestern University. And we have historically been one of the few relatively integrated suburbs, racially and ethnically, in the Chicago area, which you may know is one of the most segregated, communities in the country. But Evanston has a deep history of these wrongs to its residents of color. And so I'm going to use this first map. We can get that up. It's up now, but it's really hard to really see this map. It's from 1930s. It is the map from the Homeowners Loan Corporation. That was the organization that told you where you should invest your money and where you shouldn't. And so this is kind of Chicago from part of the South Side up into the very first suburb, which is Evanston. And if you look up there, you see a red blotch up there. And that is part of Evanston that was redlined. So this map is about from 1930s. So I wanted to show these because it really is, these maps, the green area was wonderful. The blue area was okay. The yellow area was declining or at risk. And the red area was, you just didn't put money there, right? So if we go to the next map, please, I want to be able to show you a little more of Evanston itself. So here is our Evanston map. Evanston is about 7.5 square miles. We're not a very big community. We have about just under 75,000 people. But that red area, that D2 area, is our historically redlined area and was where Evanston allowed African Americans to live. Very nice, let them into the community, which, well, I guess it was better than some communities which didn't allow anybody in at all. But our African American population was pretty much forced to live there by racial covenants that were used in other parts of the city to deny African Americans or Blacks from the ability to live there. I mean, we had things like premises shall not be conveyed, leased to, or occupied by anyone not a Caucasian, followed by parentheses, servants accepted. So that's just one example of the type of covenants we have in on some of our properties or had on them. And back in 2002, our city council passed a resolution in support of the U.S. House of Representatives resolution, HR 40, which still hasn't been approved, but we're all hoping will get passed. But that was the first time Evanston really acknowledged as a city that there had been wrongs done to people of color, particularly in Evanston, African Americans. And then it took until June of 2019 for us to take the next step, when our council passed Resolution 58R19, which was a commitment to end structural racism and achieve racial equity in Evanston. So it took us a number of years, but we're moving toward from acknowledging wrongs to African Americans who were enslaved in the country overall to acknowledging the wrongs that were going on in our community. And shortly after that, in November of 2019, we passed Resolution 126R19 that established a reparations fund and a reparations committee. So now we've moved on to we've acknowledged it. Now we're going to try to figure out what to do about it. This was led by then council member Robin Rue Simmons, who has since stepped down from her council position, but continues her reparations work. But she was following up on the initial work and working actually with also Lionel Jean-Baptiste, who was one of the founders of he really pushed for the resolution in 2002 to acknowledge that there were wrongs to start with. So this has been, we have had a number of council members and people in our community working on this for quite a while. There are a number of things that I think worked really well. How would you fund a reparations? How would you come up with the funding for reparations? Well, Illinois had recently passed legalized recreational cannabis. We're a few years behind a lot of other places. But one of the things that we had then is an opportunity to use the money from that tax. There's a 3% tax that the local communities get for recreational cannabis sales. So we dedicated the first 10 million of that revenue for reparations. So that was a start. And actually, I'm going to ask Lisa, go back to that slide that I always forget. If you could just go back to the third slide, because I showed you where our redlining area was, and I failed to say advance the slide to show you the long-term impact of what redlining and all those things have on communities. So if you look at this map, those of you who do anything with community development block grant funding, you know you have your low and moderate income areas. And the yellow areas are areas that are more than 51% low and moderate income residents. And there's a remarkable alignment with what was the redlined area. And it kind of expanded a bit on the east side of the railroad tracks. That's what that blackish line running through there is. But part of that is because we have a lot of Northwestern students who live off campus. So that kind of skews that the population in the American Community Survey, they respond as low income. And so that skews the population somewhat. But that particular area, and notably the one census tract, 8092, I know it well, which is that sort of triangular shape, is our historically African-American neighborhood, and also is now one of our still lowest income areas with the least investment going back to those years of redlining. So when we're looking at how we can do reparations, one of the first things that was discussed was some people said, well, we should do something with housing and we should help African Americans buy homes in the 5th Ward that was historically the redlined area. And somebody pointed out, well, then we'd be just doing our own redlining. No, we should maybe do something we should let them, because there was that need to invest in that area. So how do we invest in an area that's been underinvested? But more important, how does Evanston make up for the wrongs that were done to Black residents of Evanston? One of the things you always have to deal with when you're trying to do anything like this is possibility of legal challenges. We've already had some. And one of the ways that we can address that is by trying to tie our program very specifically to wrongs of the city, which is one of the reasons housing became a topic for reparations, because we could show that the city had supported and allowed redlining and other discriminatory practices. It also is something that we looked at because it's a way of providing direct reparations are to repair the wrongs of the past. And so by helping with housing for people who we had wronged that way, we are repairing that past, those past actions. So it worked that way too. But an important thing is it wasn't the city that developed the reparations program. A committee was formed. It was headed by 3 of our aldermen, and there was a lot of community discussion. What format could reparations take? We have a wonderful resident, Dino Robinson, who is the founder of Shorefront, which is an organization that has cataloged the history of African Americans in Evanston and the North Shore. Dino and members of the Evanston History Center did a lot of research and put together a pretty lengthy document that you can actually see on our website that talks about the wrongs, which gave us the facts to say we have to address this. The program itself was designed by the people who'd been wronged. It wasn't the city going, oh, gee, I think we ought to do this. You know, somebody like me in the housing and community, in the housing department saying, this is how I think we ought to make reparations. That really wasn't our decision. So this was driven by a community process of people who actually were the people who were wronged by the city's action. But we hope it helps address other problems that are current. We are losing part of our African-American population. In 1990, Evanston was almost 23% Black, and in 2018, it had gone down to about 16.5%. So we're losing our African-American population. In many cases, they're finding they have opportunities elsewhere. So how can we help build opportunities for people who are wronged? The committee came up with a program that has 3 components, and they specifically address the things that the policies and procedures of the past prevented African Americans from doing. One thing is to provide money as down payment assistance for somebody wanting to purchase a home. Okay, that's pretty straightforward. An important thing is that it couldn't be needs-based. It's not like, oh, you know, when you do a down payment assistance program and you say, well, this is the gap you need to be able to buy your house. It's if they qualify, they qualify. They get $25,000, and this can't be used to exclude them from getting other funding if they're eligible for it. The second thing is they can use, if they have a home in Evanston, their primary residence, they can get the money for repairing or expanding or remodeling their home. And the third thing, because many people couldn't get the funding to keep their properties up, that's another impact of the redlining and of people not being able to get loans even when they already own there. The third thing is they can take that $25,000 and put it against an existing mortgage to build equity, because that's another thing that the discriminatory practices really prevented Blacks in Evanston from building the kind of equity, which turns into things, you know, being passed on to children helps build intergenerational wealth. We all know that housing owning a house is one of the greatest ways that people have built their individual wealth and contributed to intergenerational wealth. So those 3 aspects to the program are the 3 ways that somebody who is eligible can use money. Who is eligible? Well, the discriminatory practices that we've been documented took place between very specific periods in time. So they were wrongs done between 1919 and 1969 when the Fair Housing Act was passed. So to be eligible, someone has to have been living in Evanston during that time period, a person of Black or an African-American descent, or they have to be the direct descendant of one of those people. So that's what establishes eligibility. Now, we have the program designed. It hasn't been formally approved by City Council and implemented yet. That's the next step. We have had a new committee formed because the committee that developed this has now been dissolved, and there is a more permanent committee that's been put in place. And that committee will actually be the committee that reviews applications and decides who's eligible. That is not something that's going to be done by a staff person. A staff person will ultimately help implement the program. But my role, people say, what's your role in the reparations program, Sarah? And I say, my role is to allow the people who have been wronged to determine what constitutes reparations and help implement the program that they design. So that, I think, is something that's really important. And, you know, Lisa, you were talking about how it's but the most effective way to use money is this to get people housed, you know. And so I think that's sort of an aha moment when you start trying to figure out how do you make reparations, and you have to allow the people who are wronged to determine the form reparations should take. And I'm going to tell you, not everybody agrees. What a surprise, right? Does everybody ever agree on anything? There are some people, members of the African-American community in Evanston, who say, well, I don't think that's what we should be doing. We should be doing X, Y, or Z. And to that we say, this is the first program. It is not to be the only program. This was, the council approved $400,000 for this program. So that's going to maybe amount to 16 people getting reparations, but we're not going to pretend that it addresses the wrongs done to everyone, nor are we going to pretend that it addresses the wrongs done by the entire country or throughout the entire country. It's local reparations, one step at a time, and we hope to build on it. And those are going to be ongoing conversations and ongoing steps as we move forward.
Thank you so much, Sarah. And I know that there's a couple of questions. I think one question maybe you can just answer quickly. How will reparations recipients be determined, especially with biracial individuals? I think you answer that kind of in terms of eligibility, but maybe you can just restate your answer.
And it really is, you know, that's a challenge, because if there is no such thing as any pure race is a construct anyway that we all came up with. But so we have our policies and procedures, if you will, and we do have types of documentation that people need to provide to show that they lived in Evanston. But to a large extent, people have to show, can show they're either they're descended from an African-American or a Black person, or using any number of things. And one is the old census data, which is a very interesting thing, because census data, after those 72 years, you can actually get the defined race and ethnicity then. But that, again, an important thing is it isn't going to be a staff person sitting someplace going, oh yes, I looked at this person, I think they're Black, or I think they're something else. The individuals write up in their application, and the committee, which is made up of people who are African-American primarily, not exclusively, there are some people, but are going to make that determination.
Thank you, Sarah. And now we're going to go talk about how communities can build wealth as well through home ownership, and talk a little bit about the state legislation that passed SB 1079, allowing eligible tenants and nonprofits 45 days after sale at foreclosure to buy a home by matching the last and highest bid. That's a new law. And the Los Angeles Land Trust Coalition is working to pass the Tenants Opportunity to Purchase Act. So that would give tenants in unincorporated areas of LA County the first opportunity to buy the buildings they live in. And so I think the question is, how is it materially different when the local community not only owns the land, but makes decisions about that? And to discuss that, Fanny, could you introduce yourself and tell us about the work you're doing through Fideicomiso Comunitario Tierra Libre?
Yes, thank you. Hey there, everyone. My name is Fanny Guzman Ortiz, and I'd like to start by recognizing that I am an occupied Tongaba land, or currently known as Boyle Heights, the east side. And I'm also the co-founding member and board member of Fideicomiso Comunitario Tierra Libre. And I'm also a board member of the California Community Land Trust Network. So today I'm here to share my experience working with our cohort of the LACOTs. We are where we all resonated with a movement-led approach, that centers Black, Indigenous people of color, leadership, and building capacity for communities to own and steward land. We are intentionally disrupting the narrative of the extractive tenant-landlord relationship by deliberately addressing the historical inequities that have impacted our communities politically and economically. But before I dive deeper into my personal experience, I'd like to go back into time to the first community land trust, New Communities, Inc., a COT rooted in a history of racial and economic justice in America. The first COT was emerged by sharecroppers and civil rights activists in response to the exploitation of stolen land and slave labor deeply rooted in America. New Communities, Inc. is a COT deeply rooted in alternatives path for economic and social justice for Black, Indigenous people of color. Next slide, please. A COT is a nonprofit organization that seeks to maintain the affordability of housing and in some cases, non-housing buildings and land uses in perpetuity by acquiring land and removing it from the speculative relationship state market. A COT has three important functions: community ownership to ensure land is used for the common good, not for profit. The ground lease separates the land and the structure. The ground lease secures for the land and the structure to remain affordable in perpetuity and gives tenants an exclusive right for tenants to create opportunities to have multiple options for tenant ownership through co-ops, single-family units, or multi-family units. The stewardship of the COT allows for housing affordability, housing stability, and housing quality. Next slide, please. The COT's governance is broken into three parts: 1/3 of COT residents, 1/3 other community residents, and 1/3 experts and stakeholders vested in the community. Next slide. In the market rate, there is a myth that a family will build wealth, but who has access? Shared equity through a COT model ownership is accessible and affordable for the poor and working class Black, Indigenous people of color. Next slide. Historically, communities of Black, Indigenous people of color have been impacted by racist housing policies like redlining, but modern redlining is felt more so through the predatory lending and discrimination in mortgage lending. The COT model we are emerging in Los Angeles, it is a COT ecosystem that is addressing the historical inequities. We are deliberately centering racial justice, equity, and community control at every level of organizational process. Next slide. Thank you. Tenants are engaging in the decision-making process, democratically leading the work of transforming their communities as the most impacted by redlining policies that have kept our communities disinvested. By taking land and housing off the speculative market, we are transforming the extractive real estate practices and challenging existing assumptions about gentrification and displacement that portray it as positive. Next slide. Fideicomiso Comunitario Tierra Libre is a grassroots CLT founded in 2018 by community leaders and with the support of Legal Aid Foundation, Los Angeles. We are the first community land trust in the East Side. We are predominantly led by women of color. The majority of the women are monolingual and part of the non-informal economy. Our objectives is to grow our infrastructure to provide services for capacity building for the membership and to decommodify housing and land to take out of the speculative market and make housing affordable in perpetuity. We are building relationships locally, regionally, and statewide to emerge a strong CLT movement with the Los Angeles Community Land Trust Coalition and the California Community Land Trust Network. Next slide. The Fideicomiso board structure is made up of 3 parties. We have the leasing members, community members, and general members. Next slide. In November of 2020, we passed policy at the county level to secure $14 million through our policy work to acquire at-risk housing and prevent displacement of tenants. Next slide. The Simmons building was acquired through the grant of public funding and a grant from Spark for due diligence to get into escrow. We partner with local community development corporation who assisted us through the acquisition process and will train us to do the asset management work and help Fideicomiso implement a co-op for the tenants to take ownership of the building. Next slide. In LA, we built this infrastructure, and this is why we are trying to implement the state policy. This is public funding. These are our partners. And now we just imagine what we can do at the state level. Next slide. We are pushing to create more opportunities for families to become CLT homeowners. In the fall, SB 1079 passed, giving tenants and nonprofits a chance to match prices at foreclosure actions. In the spring, a tenant in a foreclosed home partnered with Northern California CLT to buy the property as that first acquisition through SB 1079. Next slide. Now that the California Community Land Trust Network is fighting to have the state create a program to help more tenants and CLTs buy home at risk of foreclosure, the Senate and Assembly have supported a $500 million acquisition program called the Foreclosure Intervention Housing Preservation Program that would turn around displacement and create permanently affordable housing instead. The governor has endorsed the idea yet, so please put in a good word for us to get a chance. Thank you. I'll pass it on to Lisa.
Thank you so much, Fanny. So now it's time for questions and discussion. In the Q&A, there is really a question about the structure of our the housing creation process. And if we don't disrupt that process, how can we make change? So I'd like to throw that question back to you, Theo, and see if you know, what your thoughts are. I know that there's been talk about decolonializing or decolonizing our thinking about housing from a market-based, what you can afford model to what is needed model. So just like to get your thoughts on that.
Thanks for that, Lisa, and thank you so much, Fanny and Sarah. And I think you heard in the reflections different efforts to sort of try to decolonize that model, right? To try to push that wealth thing. And in fact, you know, many folks who've been part of the racial and social justice movement are really uncomfortable with the widespread use of reparations because they're worried about it being commodified to signify something different, something really narrow. And in fact, even the frame of reparations, as Sarah, you know, kind of connected it back to redlining, and Fanny referenced sharecroppers. This is part of a long struggle. So I think if we're not careful, those of us who are interested in racial and social justice can do real damage and real harm. I think, you know, from my experience in the work in the Bay Area, and they say that the road to hell is paved with good intentions, painfully so. We have tried our best, and we've done a brilliant job creating new affordable housing, beautiful buildings. But this question that you're asking, Lisa, about fundamentally disrupting our assumptions, and I even see some assumptions in the chat about, well, we can't give those people money. We need to teach those people how to save it and spend it. We can't give those people this unless they know this and that. That's not exactly what reparations is about. That's not what social justice is about. Restitution is about repairing the systematic harm that was purposefully and intentionally done on communities of color, the extraction of wealth. So it's not about this sort of capitulating to market norms and what we think should be. It's actually doing as Fanny did, as Sarah's talking about, partnering with community, partnering with those most impacted, and following their lead, like a shepherd following the sheep, right? Because in my experience with the 3,000 households that I worked for across 4 different communities, is folks actually know what is best for them. And so if we're actually intent, if we're committed to repairing that systematic harm, then we have to disrupt our assumptions. We have to disrupt our norms. And I know in the Bay Area, we have so many resources. If we believe in the humanity of Black and Brown people, then we can come up with different models for housing. We actually can utilize our resources to create wealth for those folks who've been so disconnected from it for generations. But it does require that kind of intention and that kind of willingness to try and do something different. You have, in my last point, you have no idea how often folks say it can't be done, Theo. You can't do a neighborhood preference in this way. You can't do a multi-generational preference in this way. There's fair housing law. There's this and that. There's not enough money. It actually can be done. It can be done if we have the political will and if we have the community partnerships to actually look at this model anew. And if we don't, then we'll see the horrors that we see on the streets. Black and brown folks, injection sites, tents, and we will pay the cost. And we're living this in San Francisco, actually.
Thank you, Theo. There's a question for Fanny. What would you say were some of the greatest challenges as a grassroots organization in establishing the CLT and doing the work of securing a project?
I'm sorry, can you say the question again?
So what would you say were some of the greatest challenges as a grassroots organization in establishing the CLT and doing the work of securing a project? What was your greatest challenge?
The greatest challenge is always going to be having access to funding, funding is the greatest challenge, and also policies. So we know that as grassroots leaders, we have to be protagonists and do the work. We have to create those relationships within our community, and then we also have to build it regionally and statewide, and hopefully we do it further out. Because housing it's the new form of commodity in this capitalist system. And so, the needs and wants may be the same in all different communities. So we have to create that relationship in order for us to be able to make a movement like we're doing with the LA CLT coalition. And hopefully we can create the same ecosystem with the California CLT network as well. But the challenge is always going to be having access to capital and bringing those resources back to our community.
Thank you, Fanny. I did want to call out that Housing California is sponsoring AB 1375, which would create a statewide tenant opportunity to purchase, and it's a 2-year bill that's moving next year. So I just wanted to bring that up. And then I wanted to pose a question to Sarah. There's a question. So Richard Rothstein had an op-ed in New York Times last fall suggesting that appraisers, realtors, banks, and others were complicit in redlining. How about they gained wealth from doing that work? How about having them add some funding to the mix? And was there anything like that discussed? And maybe you can talk about kind of what you say to people that said, there's other deserving folks that need help too.
Well, and that's one of the real challenges when you're trying to do a specific reparations program. It is never supposed to be nobody else needs help. What you're supposed to be doing is helping specific people that you have wronged. Evanston is certainly hoping that other organizations will come forward and look at their own complicity and their own responsibility. And we're seeing some of that. Northwestern University actually had a allocated $500,000 for community organizations to apply for a wide range of things that could address inequities in our community. It wasn't necessarily specifically reparations for individuals who had been harmed by Northwestern, the way the city's reparations is structured with this one program, but really because Northwestern, in all that research that we were doing about what the city did, if you were a person of color and you were at Northwestern University, you were not allowed to live on campus, for one thing. You know, there were plenty of things that that Northwestern did. We haven't had any other businesses, the real estate businesses, come forward, or the appraisers or anybody currently. But one of the things that Evanston did, and this was in 1989 to 1990, we worked with Interfaith Housing, which was a fair housing organization, and they were doing testing, and they documented steering and other racial inequity practices that were going on. And back then, two of the real estate companies actually resulted in a $650,000 settlement. I don't know the details of that. I wasn't here at that point, but so the city had been trying to get some action even before it admitted its own complicity from the real estate companies, because there was steering. There was still, redlining was officially outlawed, but steering continued. And even now, one of the things I'm personally trying to get rid of is single family zoning, the infamous. And in fact, I'm trying to get rid of defining things as a single family neighborhood or anything kind. The built environments, these are dwelling units. The people who live in them should be able to define how they want to make their households. And when you think about it, the way many of our occupancy codes have been written are very skewed toward a white middle class and upper middle class belief in how you live, who you have in your house. I mean, we've looked at some of interestingly enough, we have occupancy standards in our zoning code, which I just don't think makes sense anyway. You're using a land use process to deal with occupancy. So we're working on changing that. But it really is, there are all of these systemic policies that are in place that continue to prevent people from developing housing or virtually anything else in ways that can benefit people who've been historically discriminated against. And I think we all have to look at that. We've had some situations where people are saying, why is affordable housing? We had a 16-unit permanent supportive housing building being built, and some of the neighbors were upset that this was in their neighborhood. And part of it, we're a landlocked area, a town, there isn't a whole lot of land. But one of the things that I asked them to do is come and work with me and others on trying to change zoning that prevented us from building 16-unit buildings in other parts of town. So, there's just a lot of work that has to be done. There are so many things in place that really prevent equity and perpetuate discriminatory practices. I hope that helps answer that.
Yeah, Lisa, you got to get on this, because I see in the chat there's questions about like how we actually do this, and Sarah's brilliance in terms of Evanston, but San Francisco, right? And I know you've lived this, high cost city, mayor's office, amazing affordable housing, mission-driven developers, and yet what's being done, what could be done, how do we shift that orientation? I mean, I remember stuff we would work on where we're supposed to have habitat units, or we're supposed to have affordable units set aside, or we're supposed to have home ownership opportunities. And it was almost like a mindset shift that has to happen in order to actually get us there. Anything you want to say just about actually what's happening in the Bay and how we?
I think, the biggest impediment to implementing more homeownership in the Bay Area specifically is the high cost. And I think that one of the conversations that will come out of the statewide task force to look at reparations, there's been suggestions like having the state purchase 45% of a house so that it can become affordable. So I think when you stop worrying about deserving and means testing and really focus on reparations, then you can come to kinds of solutions that will help create more opportunities. I think, there's a lot of discussion in the questions in the chat about we keep trying to work within this framework that just perpetuates inequality. And how do we get out of that? I think is to reframe the question and support efforts like, if it takes 45% of a house being purchased by the state to get a house to somebody, that's what we need to support. And, other non-housing approaches, including, paying for college and things like that. I know in San Francisco, there's kind of that idea of putting a deposit into a savings account for children that are low income that are born in the city. And, this is sort of extrapolating that and coming up with different ideas. But I think once you embrace the idea of reparations, rather than this is a housing and community development program about housing, and we can step back, I think we can think a lot more creatively. And really, if we're righting a wrong, the approach is very different. So I don't know, Fanny or Sarah, if you have other thoughts on that?
Just a quick note, one of the things, housing was just one of the things that was put in our reparations resolution as a possible thing to look at. Education and economic opportunity were also directly put in there as something that the city felt responsibility for helping address those inequities. And so it is important. There is no one solution to pretty much anything as complicated as the disparities and how they're caused. And I think one of the biggest problems is we still see, if somebody else gets something, the feeling that something is being taken away from, and we have to get away from that, because it's that, I think, is one of the things that creates the most tension. And it's just like, well, if that person gets something, then what am I losing? And that's the wrong way of looking at it. We all gain. I think we somehow have to get to that.
Thank you, Sarah. That's a really good point. Fanny, would you like to weigh in?
Yeah, I mean, I think we're doing the work, and we just need to make sure that those that have access to funding or being able to help Black, Indigenous, people of color, maybe they need to sit down and work with us, with the people doing the work, with the community land trust ecosystem that we're emerging in LA. We need to have access to the funding to be able to continue acquiring and protecting and investing in our communities. I'm sure that's the same work that Theo is doing in the Bay Area. It's just having access to those resources, because we need to bring them back to our community to be able to continue doing the work that we are reimagining. And we're proving that it is possible using public funding. But we also need to access philanthropy funding, as well as from banks. They have so much to give back to communities. I think someone posted something about how can we talk about reparations and redlining as well when we have Wells Fargo and another,
JP
and
Morgan.
JP Morgan here. They have the funding. They should create the space to work with us, and see how they can be part of the work um, that we're trying to emerge in LA.
It's a really beautiful point. It's a fair question. It's an uncomfortable question. I love what Sarah said. It's not a zero-sum game, right? But it does require a shift from a charitable model to a more transformative model. And this is at every phase of the development cycle. This is pre-development. This is organizing. This is during development. I mean, I'm complicit in it, right? Well-intentioned gatekeeper. We built incredible buildings that in many ways are statues for gentrification, right? As you build these buildings, as you build these 6-story, 5-story buildings, you demolish basketball courts, you take away the open space, you take away the opportunity for folks to own and to build wealth. There's a harm there. There's a racialized harm that's enacted upon these communities. And as we go across the country and we see supposedly, Boyle Heights. I mean, I grew up in LA, like Leimert Park, like we know the names, the South Side of Chicago. We know the names of the communities that used to be something, and we've raised it and we've built buildings, but no one thought, or maybe people thought, no one stopped to say, well, is there a community land trust? Is there an opportunity for not like 5 folks to own something here, to retain it, to ensure that community wealth happens? And that requires some difficult decisions on the part of our sponsors and banks and others to say, we're not going to do the charitable model. We're not philanthropy. We're not going to give 1% of 1%. We're actually going to give a little bit more, and we're going to repair that systematic harm because we know that it's in all of our best interests. Because actually, targeted universalism teaches you when you actually focus on those most impacted, all folks benefit. And it's not this zero-sum game that we have a sense of, but it does require a fundamental change in orientation.
Okay, wow. We still have a lot of work to do. I think one of the questions that came up in the Q&A is also about that individual wealth building, that wealth gap. Is there any last thoughts on how structurally through housing or not, we can address that? Any thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I'll defer to Sarah on this. I love that question because, frankly, when we looked at the numbers and the economics, home ownership is not necessarily for everyone, right? You look at high-cost cities like Tokyo and New York City, where folks can build wealth, and it may not be through home ownership. So Sarah said this, it's not to be a panacea. There are multiple ways to go about this. We think about entrepreneurship. We think about the Community Reinvestment Act and how it can create business ownership opportunities, community wealth opportunities. So I don't want to sit here and suggest that the only way to close the racial wealth gap to this question is through home ownership. That is not for all folks. But as you look at COVID and recovery and vacancies in San Francisco, what are the incubators for Black businesses and for brown businesses and for businesses of folks of color? What are the ways in which we're creating more economic ladders and opportunities? So reparations is not meant to just be about housing, but as you close that racial wealth gap, there are multiple things. You look at the stock market and mutual funds, and again, our banks are involved in this, are complicit in that. So I think it's a really good question, Lisa, and we know that depending on the context, home ownership may be right, but in some spaces and places, it really is not, should not be of the focus.
I'd like to bring up another thing that I'm interested in seeing us further, and that is cooperatives, not housing cooperatives, but cooperatives of, that are business cooperatives, because that's another way that people can build wealth and equity that isn't land on their own. But if the workers own the business, then that is a way of building equity. And it is also a way of giving workers more control over the business. And this is a real tough one. We have a very small development corporation that has been founded in Evanston, and their primary purpose was to build accessory dwelling units, detached accessory dwelling units, using this new panelized construction that is energy efficient and all these wonderful things. And but it is owner it's worker owned. There are investors as well, but they can invest only to a very specific amount, and they only have, no matter how much you invest, you don't have more than one vote. So it's very different from, and that follows Illinois' cooperative laws, which aren't always the best, but we have to work on. But that's another way to look at, Cleveland, for example, there is a laundromat that is a cooperative that does the laundry for the all the medical entities in Cleveland. And so there are things like that that I think we have to explore more. I'm interested in the idea of a childcare cooperative, because one of the things we're running into as we're trying to get people back to work is there's a lack of childcare. It's low paying, so nobody can make a living at it. And the traditional childcare providers don't provide the hours and the times that match up with the hours that many of our workers, especially our lower income ones, need to have childcare. There's not weekend childcare, there's not evening shifts. And so I'm thinking that maybe that can be a way we can build some kind of organization owned by people who need the childcare, and they can create a childcare cooperative. So haven't gotten too far on that one yet, but it's certainly something that I'm bringing up because we can't find childcare for people right now. I think we have to be creative, and we have to be open to a lot of new ideas, and try to see what we can bring up. And does everything work all the time? No. We can learn from each other. I learned a great deal from, I look kind of like Illinois is not as progressive in having state housing laws. They just actually passed some of the first that were positive, as opposed to things like, no, you can't do this. So we keep watching the coasts. You're generally a little farther ahead of us on a lot of that stuff, and we appreciate it. So.
Thank you, Sarah. So on that note, hopefully that our coastal innovation and California big ideas can work to address this question. So we are wrapping up, and I would like to say thank you to Fanny and Theo and Sarah, and bring back Felicia to close us out.
Well, thank you to all of our speakers for the thought-provoking conversation about how to expand opportunities to build wealth through homeownership, particularly for communities of color. Next, you're not going to want to miss a very special virtual screening and panel discussion on the Way Home documentary series presented by Kaiser Permanente. We are proud to work with Kaiser to unveil the season 2 of this remarkable series here at Housing California's Unconference. And we'll look forward to seeing everyone at 9 a.m. tomorrow for a welcome by trailblazer and progressive icon, Congresswoman Barbara Lee from California's 13th Congressional District, as well as concurrent workshops on hot topics such as tenant-led housing justice movements and housing and health. Later in the day, we'll talk with key leaders in the Newsom administration and with our closing keynote speaker, Michael Tubbs, a leading voice on guaranteed income. Plus, more workshops, music, exhibit booths, networking, HCD office hours, and meditation and movement. See you all tomorrow at 9 a.m. Thank you.